Please, someone help him. He just won't eat at all. Victoria Montgomery's voice cracked. A fragile plea carried on the weight of desperation, as she watched yet another nanny retreat. Defeated, out the door. Upstairs, in the opulent nursery, 18-month-old Oliver's feeble cries echoed through the vast mansion. A symphony of sorrow that clawed at the edges of the pristine silence. 2 weeks. 2 weeks without a morsel of food passing his lips. The vibrant spark in the baby's eyes was dimming. His tiny body visibly shrinking, and all the Montgomery wealth couldn't buy him back his appetite, his life. Grace Williams, a silent observer, pushed her cleaning cart down the seemingly endless hallway, a ghost gliding through the gilded cage of the Montgomery residence. 6 months she'd worked there, and the family barely registered her presence. Just another uniformed face, another cog in the machine of their affluent lives. But as she passed Oliver's room, a subtle shift in the crying snagged her attention. The raw, angry wails had surrendered to a quiet, heartbreaking resignation, a giving up. Compelled by an invisible force, she opened the door. The little boy sat forlornly in his oversized crib, tears carving tracks down his gaunt cheeks. His tiny hands, pale and fragile, gripped the bars as if clinging to the last vestiges of hope. Their eyes locked, and in that instant, Oliver performed an act he hadn't in weeks. He reached out to her, his small fingers outstretched in a silent plea. Grace's heart twisted with a wrenching empathy. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to gather him in her arms, to offer comfort, to help him. But she was just the cleaning lady, an invisible presence meant to scrub away the grime, not meddle in the lives of the elite. This wasn't her place. Except, why had this child, who rejected the nannies, the doctors, even his own mother, reacted to her? Little did Grace know that one simple, compassionate act would plunge her headfirst into a swirling nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Behind the polished marble floors, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the carefully curated image of perfection, this family was concealing a darkness, a secret so terrible it threatened to consume them all, a darkness that lived in locked rooms, in the ashes of burned photographs, and in the chilling undercurrent of whispered threats. The deeper Grace delved, the more she realized that saving this precious baby might cost her everything, her job, her safety, perhaps even her life. But walking away, that was no longer an option. Before we delve further into this unfolding drama, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from right now? And what time is it in your city? I find it fascinating to see how far these stories travel, connecting us across continents and time zones. And if you're someone who appreciates stories that stir the soul, stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit, I invite you to join our community. Give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Together, we can amplify these narratives of hope and resilience, bringing comfort and inspiration to those who need it most. The morning sun, a pale intruder, sliced through the towering windows of the Montgomery mansion, but even its warmth couldn't penetrate the chilling atmosphere within. Grace Williams stood in the sprawling kitchen, her hands submerged in soapy water, dutifully scrubbing a crystal glass that likely cost more than her entire monthly rent. 6 months she'd been employed in this opulent prison, and she still hadn't grown accustomed to the oppressive silence. Rich people's houses were always eerily quiet, as if even the very air they breathed was painstakingly curated and priced beyond her reach. Grace, where are you? Victoria Montgomery's voice, sharp and edged with panic, echoed down the hallway, shattering the fragile peace. Grace quickly dried her hands on a dish towel and hurried toward the sound of distress. She found Victoria standing in the nursery doorway, her usually flawless makeup showing the first signs of cracking around her swollen, red-rimmed eyes. "He won't eat," Victoria said, her voice breaking, the words barely a whisper. "Natalie tried everything. The pediatrician is coming this afternoon, and I don't even know what to tell her. He's losing weight. She stopped abruptly, pressing her manicured fingers against her temples, as if trying to hold herself together. "Can you just clean the upstairs bathroom? I need everything perfect when Dr. Carter arrives." Grace nodded silently, offering no platitudes or empty assurances. She knew from experience that Victoria Montgomery wasn't looking for sympathy, just compliance. She moved past her into the hallway, but as she walked by the nursery, she heard it. A sound that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Oliver was crying, but it wasn't the robust, angry crying of a healthy, demanding toddler. This was a weak, listless whimper, the sound of a child who had simply given up. She paused at the doorway, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. Natalie Brooks, the latest in a long line of nannies, stood by the crib with her arms crossed, observing Oliver with a detached, almost clinical gaze, as if he were a complex puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The baby sat amidst a mountain of expensive, untouched toys, tears streaming down his delicate face, his tiny chest heaving with each shallow breath. "He's being difficult," Natalie said coldly when she noticed Grace's presence. "Some children are just naturally stubborn. Mrs. Montgomery spoils him rotten." Grace said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had learned early on that speaking up in this house only invited trouble. But something about the way Natalie spoke of Oliver, as if he were a burden rather than a scared, vulnerable little boy, ignited a spark of anger within her. Natalie, sensing the unspoken disapproval, huffed and left the room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Grace stood there, caught between her sense of duty and the overwhelming pull to comfort the child. She knew she should leave, that this wasn't her job. She was just the cleaning lady, an insignificant player in this high-stakes drama. But Oliver's crying grew softer, weaker. Each sob a tiny stab at her heart, and her feet refused to move. Driven by an irresistible impulse, she walked slowly into the nursery. Oliver looked up at her with his big, exhausted eyes. He was heartbreakingly beautiful, with light brown skin, soft, unruly curls, and cheeks that should have been round and full, but were beginning to appear hollow and gaunt. 18 months old, and already learning the harsh lesson that the world could be a cruel and unforgiving place. "Hey, little one," Grace whispered, kneeling beside the crib, her voice barely audible above the child's whimpers. "You're having a rough day, huh?" Oliver stared at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. For a brief, precious moment, he stopped crying, his breath catching in his throat. His tiny hand reached through the bars of the crib, his fingers opening and closing in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic motion. Grace, a mother of 2 grown children herself, recognized that gesture instantly. He wanted to be held. He was desperate for comfort, for human connection. She glanced nervously at the door. Victoria would be furious if she found Grace touching Oliver, interfering in matters that were deemed far above her station. Natalie would likely report her, eager to curry favor with the Montgomerys. But the baby's hand kept reaching, his fingers grasping at the empty air, and Grace's heart was breaking into a million pieces. Ignoring the potential consequences, she picked him up carefully, supporting his fragile body with gentle hands. Oliver immediately pressed his face against her shoulder, burying his face in the crook of her neck. His small body relaxed against hers, as if he had been waiting for this moment all morning, craving the simple reassurance of human touch. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. How long had it been since someone had simply held this child, without agenda or expectation, like he truly mattered? "It's okay," she whispered, rocking him gently back and forth. "You're safe now. I got you." Oliver made a small sound, a soft, almost inaudible murmur. Not quite a word, but something close to a sigh of relief. Grace noticed the baby monitor on the shelf, its red light blinking steadily. Someone was likely watching, monitoring every move. But in that moment, she simply didn't care anymore. She settled into the rocking chair by the window, still cradling Oliver close to her chest. His breathing gradually slowed, becoming steady and calm. She hummed an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a simple, soothing melody that had been passed down through generations. Oliver's eyes began to flutter closed. That's when she saw it. A small, unmistakable mark on his inner arm, shaped like a crescent moon. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was exactly like the birthmark her sister Sarah had. Exactly. Grace's mind began to race, a whirlwind of disbelief and dawning realization. It had to be a coincidence. Surely it was just a random birthmark, a common occurrence. Lots of people had them, but something about it felt profoundly wrong. Or maybe profoundly right. She couldn't explain the unsettling certainty that gripped her. The door creaked open. Victoria stood there frozen, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief, staring at Grace holding her son. "What are you doing?" Victoria's voice was like shards of ice, each word laced with barely suppressed fury. Grace stood up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Montgomery. He was crying so hard, and I just put him down," Victoria said quietly, her voice dangerously controlled. Too quietly. Grace gently placed Oliver back in the crib. The baby immediately started crying again, his little hands reaching out desperately toward her. The sound tore through Grace's chest, a physical ache of empathy and longing. Victoria walked to the crib and attempted to pick Oliver up, but he stiffened in her arms, pushing away from her with surprising strength. His little hands continued to reach toward Grace, his face contorted in a mask of distress. Victoria's face went pale, her composure beginning to crumble. She tried again, forcing a smile, her voice strained. Oliver screamed louder, his cries escalating into a full-blown tantrum. "Oliver, stop it," Victoria said, her voice shaking, the carefully constructed facade of motherhood cracking under the pressure. "Mommy's here. Stop it now." But Oliver wouldn't stop. He kept reaching for Grace, his face red and wet with tears, his small body writhing in protest. Dr. Helen Carter arrived 20 minutes later. She was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes that missed nothing and a firm, reassuring voice that commanded respect. Grace was cleaning the hallway when she overheard the doctor's words drifting from the nursery, each syllable heavy with concern. "Victoria, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Oliver has lost almost 2 pounds in 2 weeks. For a toddler his size, that's incredibly dangerous. If he doesn't start eating consistently by Monday, I'll have to consider other options. Hospital monitoring at the very minimum." "He's just being picky," Victoria said, but her voice betrayed her anxiety, cracking under the strain. "We've tried everything." "Have you, Victoria?" Dr. Carter asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Because from what you've told me, you've tried expensive nannies, specialized formulas, and every toy in the store. But have you tried simply being with him? Children don't starve themselves without a reason. Something is wrong, Victoria. You need to consider that." Grace quietly moved further down the hallway, not wanting to eavesdrop on a private conversation. But as she reached the stairs, she heard Victoria call her name, her voice laced with a mixture of desperation and reluctant acknowledgement. Grace, can you come here, please? Grace hesitated for a moment, then walked back to the nursery. Dr. Carter was holding Oliver, who was still whimpering softly, his little body tense and resistant. Victoria looked defeated, her shoulders slumped, her usual air of confidence completely gone. Dr. Carter, this is Grace. She's our housekeeper, Victoria said stiffly, her voice lacking its usual warmth. Oliver seemed to respond to her earlier. He calmed down when she held him. I don't know why. Dr. Carter looked at Grace with open curiosity, her eyes sharp and assessing. Is that right? Grace nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly under the doctor's scrutiny. He calmed down when I held him. Yes, ma'am. I don't know why either. May I? Dr. Carter gestured toward Oliver, her gaze steady and direct. Grace took the baby carefully, supporting his weight with practiced ease. As before, Oliver immediately settled against her, his crying ceasing almost instantly. He snuggled into her shoulder, his small body relaxing against hers. Dr. Carter watched with keen interest, her expression thoughtful. Interesting, the doctor said, her gaze shifting to Victoria. Children recognize safety, Victoria. Whoever they bond with, there's usually a reason. It's not magic, it's instinct. They sense trust, they sense genuine care. Victoria's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with resentment. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Grace is willing, she might be able to help with feeding times, just until we get Oliver stabilized. Dr. Carter said, turning to Grace. Would you be comfortable with that, Grace? Just to help him get back on track? Grace looked down at Oliver's tiny face, finally peaceful and relaxed. She thought about that crescent moon birthmark, about the strange, unexplainable feeling in her chest that tugged at her heartstrings. Yes, ma'am, she said, her voice firm and resolute. I'll help in any way I can. Victoria looked as if she wanted to argue, to protest the intrusion of the help into her carefully controlled world. But Dr. Carter cut her off with a raised hand. It's temporary, Victoria. Your son's health comes first. We can figure out the dynamics later. After the doctor left, Victoria turned to Grace, her expression cold and controlled once again, the brief glimpse of vulnerability completely erased. You'll feed Oliver 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. You will not take him out of this house. You will not discuss this arrangement with anyone, and you will remember your place in this household. Understood? Yes, Mrs. Montgomery. Victoria walked out of the nursery without another word, leaving Grace alone with Oliver. The baby looked up at her and smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up his entire face, the first one Grace had seen since she started working at the Montgomery mansion. She gently touched the crescent-shaped mark on his arm, tracing its outline with her fingertip. Who are you, little one? She whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of tenderness and bewilderment. And why do you feel so much like family? Oliver grabbed her finger with his tiny hand and held on tight, his grip surprisingly strong. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering ominously over Greenwich, the sky darkening with the promise of a downpour. The weather report had called for rain all weekend, but inside the Montgomery mansion, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to tear apart carefully constructed lies and force Grace to confront a truth she wasn't ready for. Because that mark on Oliver's arm wasn't just familiar. It was identical to the one her sister Sarah had. And Sarah had disappeared 18 months ago, right around the time Oliver was born. Tell me something. What city are you watching us from right now? I love hearing from all over the world. Drop it in the comments. Grace arrived at the Montgomery mansion at 6 o'clock in the morning, a full hour earlier than usual. The sky was still shrouded in darkness, and the massive house loomed against the Connecticut hills like a Gothic fortress from a movie. All sharp angles and glowing windows, exuding an aura of wealth and impenetrable secrets. She had barely slept, her mind a relentless torrent of questions and anxieties. All night long, she kept seeing that mark on Oliver's arm, that undeniable crescent moon, an exact replica of the one Sarah had borne since childhood. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate. Birthmarks were common, after all. But her hands trembled as she unlocked the service entrance with the key Victoria had given her years ago, back when Grace was just another invisible worker, a faceless member of the support staff. The kitchen was empty, the stainless steel appliances gleaming coldly under the dim light. Grace made herself a cup of strong coffee, its bitter aroma a welcome assault on her senses, and waited, pacing restlessly. At 7 o'clock, she heard the distinct click of heels on the stairs, quick and purposeful. It was Victoria, dressed in a power suit that screamed business, her makeup flawless despite the clear evidence of a sleepless night. Too much perfume clung to her, a desperate attempt to mask the underlying scent of fear. You're early, Victoria said, appearing in the doorway, her voice tight and brittle. Good. Oliver usually wakes up around 7:30. I need him fed before I leave for work. Yes, ma'am. Victoria studied her for a long moment, her gaze intense and unwavering, her expression unreadable. Grace, I want to be very clear about something. This arrangement is temporary. Once Oliver starts eating normally again, you'll return to your regular duties. Don't get attached. The warning hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud, thick with unspoken threats. Grace nodded silently, her throat constricted, but inside, something twisted with a fierce protectiveness. Asterisk, don't get attached? Asterisk, the baby had already grabbed hold of her heart, burrowing his way into the deepest recesses of her soul. Victoria left for work at 7:45, the sound of her car fading into the distance. The house fell silent once again. That heavy, expensive silence that always made Grace feel like she was walking through a museum rather than a home. An intruder in a world that wasn't hers. She went upstairs to the nursery, her footsteps light on the plush carpet. Oliver was awake, standing in his crib, his little hands gripping the rails, his face bright with anticipation. When he saw Grace, his whole face lit up with joy, his eyes sparkling with recognition. He bounced on his feet, making happy, gurgling sounds, his entire being radiating pure, unadulterated delight. "Good morning, sweet boy," Grace said, lifting him gently from the crib. Oliver wrapped his arms around her neck and squeezed tight, burying his face in her hair. It was the kind of hug that made everything else disappear, erasing the doubts, the fears, the unsettling questions that plagued her. She changed his diaper, talking to him in a soft, soothing voice the whole time. Oliver babbled back, his nonsensical sounds filled with an innocent joy. Not real words yet, but the kind of vocalizations that meant he was trying, learning, exploring the world around him. Grace's youngest son had been a late talker, too. The memory washed over her with a wave of nostalgia, a bittersweet ache in her chest. In the kitchen, she warmed up some oatmeal and mashed a ripe banana, creating a simple, wholesome meal. Simple food, the kind real babies ate, not the processed, overly fancy organic pouches that Natalie had been trying to force on him. Oliver sat patiently in his high chair, watching Grace with complete trust, his eyes fixed on her every move. "Okay, let's try this," she said, holding up the spoon, her voice gentle and encouraging. "Open up for me." Oliver opened his mouth without hesitation, his lips puckered in anticipation. Grace almost cried. It was that simple, that easy. He ate 6 full spoonfuls before getting distracted by a colorful toy, his attention span fleeting but his appetite undeniably present. 6 spoonfuls, more than he'd eaten in 2 weeks. "There you go," Grace whispered, wiping his face with a soft cloth. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Oliver grinned at her, oatmeal smeared across his chin, his eyes sparkling with mischievous delight. The precious moment was abruptly broken when Margaret O'Brien walked into the kitchen. The elderly Irish woman had worked for the Montgomerys for over 20 years, longer than anyone else. She was thin and wiry, with sharp, piercing eyes and snow-white hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. "So, it's true," Margaret said quietly, her voice tinged with a hint of something Grace couldn't quite decipher. "The baby likes you." Grace tensed, her senses on high alert. "I'm just helping out temporarily, Margaret. Nothing more." Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate, her hands gnarled with age. "You know, I raised that boy's father, changed his diapers, taught him his letters. But this house..." She paused, her gaze sweeping around the room, as if she were afraid someone might be listening. "This house has secrets, Grace. Always has." Grace's heart started beating faster, a cold premonition settling in her stomach. "What kind of secrets, Margaret?" Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, Grace saw something akin to fear flicker within their depths. A deep-seated, paralyzing fear, the kind that haunted people's dreams and destroyed their lives, the kind that hurt good people. She set down her cup with a delicate clink. "Be careful, Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And watch that boy close. He needs someone who actually cares." Before Grace could ask what she meant, what she knew, Margaret turned and left the kitchen, disappearing down the hallway as silently as she had arrived. The warning hung in the air, cold and heavy, like a shroud. The rest of the morning passed quietly, almost eerily so. Grace played with Oliver in the nursery, watching him explore his toys with the boundless energy of a healthy toddler. She fed him again at noon, offering him more oatmeal, some finely chopped fruit, and a few plain crackers. He ate everything she put in front of him, his appetite seemingly insatiable. But the whole time, Grace couldn't shake off Margaret's cryptic words. Asterisk secrets. This house has secrets. She started noticing things, small details that had previously escaped her attention, subtle inconsistencies that now seemed glaringly obvious, like how there were no baby photos of Oliver anywhere in the house. Not on the walls, not on the shelves, not even on Victoria's desk. For people as wealthy and image-conscious as the Montgomerys, that seemed decidedly strange. Rich people loved to flaunt their perfect lives, to document every milestone, to create a meticulously curated narrative of familial bliss. The absence of Oliver's baby pictures felt like a deliberate omission, a carefully orchestrated attempt to erase his early existence. At 2 o'clock, Grace was folding laundry in the upstairs hallway when she heard a door open, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent house. Richard Montgomery stepped out of his office, phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 40s, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits, always radiating an air of distracted importance. In the 6 months Grace had worked at the mansion, she had seen him perhaps 10 times, his presence fleeting and impersonal. "I don't care what it costs," he said into the phone, his voice sharp and commanding, his words laced with impatience. "I need that paperwork buried. No traces, no questions asked. We had a deal." He noticed Grace standing in the hallway and stopped talking immediately, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise, then something harder, more calculating suspicion. "I'll call you back," he said abruptly into the phone, hanging up without a word of farewell. He looked at Grace, his eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to assess the extent of her knowledge, to determine how much she had overheard. "You're the one taking care of Oliver now?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Just temporarily. Victoria tells me he's eating again." "Yes, sir. He seems to be doing much better." "That's good." He adjusted his tie, his movements stiff and unnatural. "My wife and I appreciate your help, Grace. But," he stepped closer, his presence suddenly more menacing, and she caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something bitter, something acrid that clung to him like a shadow. "Stress, maybe, or fear. This is a private family matter, Grace. Whatever you see or hear in this house stays in this house. Understood?" "Yes, sir." He walked past her down the stairs, his shoulders rigid, his steps heavy with unspoken tension. But Grace's hands were shaking uncontrollably, her heart pounding in her ears. That phone call. Asterisk buried paperwork. No traces. No questions asked. Star. What was he hiding? What secrets were buried beneath the polished facade of the Montgomery family? That afternoon, Natalie Brooks, the disgruntled nanny, returned to the house, her presence a dark cloud hanging over the nursery. Grace was playing with Oliver, helping him stack colorful blocks. When Natalie appeared in the doorway, her expression cold and disdainful. "So, you're the miracle worker?" Natalie said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, the saccharine tone failing to mask the bitterness beneath. "The cleaning lady who saved the day. How utterly charming." Grace kept her voice neutral, refusing to be drawn into a petty argument. Oliver just needed someone patient with him, someone who understood his needs. Patient? Ha! Natalie laughed derisively, the sound harsh and grating. "I have 2 degrees in early childhood development. I've worked with diplomats' children, celebrity children, the offspring of some of the most influential people in the world. But sure, the woman who scrubs toilets knows better than I do." Oliver, who had been playing quietly, looked up at Natalie, sensing the animosity in her voice, and started to fuss, his lower lip trembling. He crawled quickly to Grace and pulled himself up, using her legs as leverage, seeking refuge behind her, his small body trembling. Natalie's face flushed crimson with anger and frustration. "Ridiculous. Mrs. Montgomery is making a grave mistake letting you do this. Mark my words, Grace. This won't end well for anyone involved." She turned and left, slamming the door behind her, the sound echoing through the silent mansion. Grace picked up Oliver, holding him close to her chest, feeling his small heart beating fast against hers. "It's okay," she whispered, stroking his hair. "She's gone now. She can't hurt you." But Natalie's ominous words stayed with her, a dark premonition that lingered in the air like a poisonous gas. Asterisk, this won't end well. By evening, Grace was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Oliver had eaten dinner, real food, not just a few reluctant bites, and was finally getting sleepy, his eyelids heavy, his movements slow and languid. She was rocking him gently in the nursery, humming a soft lullaby, when Victoria came home, her presence radiating a palpable tension. "How is he?" Victoria asked from the doorway, her voice devoid of emotion. "Good," Grace said, her gaze fixed on Oliver's peaceful face. "He ate 3 full meals today. He seems much happier." Victoria nodded slowly, but she didn't look pleased or relieved. She looked worried, her eyes shadowed with a deep-seated anxiety that she couldn't quite conceal. "Grace, I need to ask you something," Victoria said, her voice tight and strained. Grace's heart dropped, a sense of dread washing over her. "Is something wrong with Oliver? Is he sick again?" "No, he's fine," Victoria said quickly. "He's sleeping soundly. But I received a concerning call last night from Margaret. She said you were in my husband's office, that you were snooping around." Grace's mouth went dry, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. "I was just what, Grace? Snooping through private files? Violating our trust?" Victoria's voice rose with each word, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "Do you have any idea how serious that is? I could call the police right now. Breaking and entering, theft of private documents." "I didn't steal anything," Grace said, forcing herself to stay calm, to maintain eye contact. The door was slightly open. "I saw papers and I—" "You what? Got curious?" Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness and a growing sense of desperation. "Let me make something very clear, Grace. Whatever you think you saw, whatever ideas you have in your head, they're wrong. Oliver is our son. Legally, completely, irrevocably. And if you cause problems, if you start asking questions you shouldn't be asking, you won't just lose your job, you'll lose much more." The veiled threat hung between them like poison, suffocating and insidious. Grace wanted to scream, to demand answers about Sarah, to confront Victoria with the evidence she had found. She wanted to shake her and force her to reveal the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. But she knew that would be a mistake, that it would end everything. She'd lose access to Oliver. She'd never find out what happened to her sister. "I understand," Grace said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Victoria studied her face for a long moment, her eyes searching for any sign of deception, any indication that Grace was still harboring doubts. "Good. Now go and take care of Oliver. Make sure he's comfortable." She paused, her gaze hardening. "And Grace, don't make me regret trusting you." Grace nodded silently and turned to leave, her legs shaking beneath her. In the quiet stillness of the nursery, Oliver stirred awake. He stood in his crib, his tiny hands reaching out the moment Grace entered the room. A wave of tenderness washed over her as she scooped him up, and he instinctively buried his face in the crook of her neck, seeking comfort. "I won't let them hurt you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." But the weight of her helplessness crashed down on her. How could she possibly keep that promise? She was just a cleaning lady, a mere speck in their world of money, power, and influential lawyers. If she pushed too hard, they wouldn't hesitate to crush her, to snatch Oliver away and disappear with him to a place where she could never find him. At breakfast, Oliver, oblivious to the turmoil swirling around him, devoured scrambled eggs and toast with gusto, his joyful babbling filling the room. Grace tried to focus on him, to lose herself in his innocent joy, but her mind was a relentless carousel of worry. During his nap, she made a desperate call to a legal aid office, clinging to a sliver of hope. But the answer was crushing, a cold dose of reality. Without concrete proof of fraud, the adoption was final. The law, the supposed bastion of justice, wouldn't help her. She was utterly alone. That afternoon, as Grace mechanically folded towels in the laundry room, Margaret found her. The old woman's face was etched with concern. "I'm sorry, child," she said quietly, her voice laced with regret. "I had to tell Mrs. Montgomery you were in the office. She asked me directly. Couldn't lie." Grace didn't look up, her focus solely on the task at hand, a futile attempt to maintain control. "It's fine." "No, it's not fine," Margaret countered, her voice firm despite her age. She sat down heavily on a chair, the years weighing on her. "You're looking for answers about that baby's real mother, aren't you?" Grace's hands froze mid-fold, the towel clutched tightly in her grasp. She slowly looked up at Margaret, her breath caught in her throat. Margaret's wrinkled face was a canvas of sadness and knowing. "I've been in this house a long time, child. I see things, hear things, and I know that baby didn't come from Mrs. Montgomery's body. She can't have children. Some medical condition. She's been heartbroken about it for years." "Then where did Oliver come from?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting nervously towards the door as if fearing unseen eavesdroppers. "There was a girl, a young black girl. She worked here for a few months, maybe 2 years ago. Kitchen helper, pretty thing, quiet. Mr. Montgomery, he paid her attention. Too much attention." Grace felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the pieces of the puzzle starting to form a disturbing picture. What happened to her? She left suddenly. One day she was here, the next she was gone. Mrs. Montgomery fired the whole kitchen staff that week, paid them off to keep quiet. Margaret's voice dropped to a mere whisper, laden with unspoken accusations. 3 months later, Mrs. Montgomery announced she was pregnant. But I never saw her belly grow, never saw her sick or tired. And then suddenly there was a baby. What was the girl's name? I don't remember. Maybe Sandra? Sarah? Something like that. Sarah? Grace repeated, a glimmer of recognition sparking in her mind. Yes, Sarah. That was it. Where did she go? Grace asked desperately, her voice filled with urgency. I don't know. But child, listen to me. Margaret grabbed Grace's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. These people are dangerous. They have friends in high places. Police, judges. If that girl tried to fight them, tried to keep her baby, Margaret's eyes welled up with tears. They would have made her disappear, and they'll do the same to you. Grace pulled her hand away, a fire igniting within her. I can't just walk away. That's my. She stopped herself, correcting her slip. That baby needs someone to fight for him. Then fight smart, Margaret urged, her voice laced with concern. Don't let them see you coming. For the next 3 days, Grace played the perfect employee, a model of obedience and efficiency. But every moment was spent gathering information, collecting phone numbers, noting names, and observing the way Victoria tensed whenever anyone mentioned birth certificates. On Thursday, Victoria hosted a gathering of friends. Grace, serving drinks, overheard one woman casually mention adoption. Victoria's response sent a shard of ice through Grace's veins. The birth mother signed all the papers, Victoria said smoothly. She was well compensated for her trouble. Compensated like Sarah was a mere transaction, a problem solved with money. That night, Grace stayed late again. She waited until the house was silent, until everyone was asleep, then crept to Richard's office. This time, she was even more cautious, her senses on high alert. She used her phone to meticulously photograph every document in that damning folder. Adoption papers, medical records, a legal agreement bearing Sarah Williams' name. But something was terribly wrong with the signature. Grace had seen Sarah's handwriting 1,000 times. This signature was similar, a clumsy imitation, but not exact. The S was off, and the loop in the W was far too large. Someone had forged it. Grace's hands shook as she photographed the last page. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold, chilling her to the very core. A bank statement showing a wire transfer for $50,000 to Sarah Williams dated 18 months ago. $50,000 compensation, Victoria had called it. But Sarah had never touched that money. Grace had checked Sarah's bank account dozens of times. Nothing had ever been deposited. So where did the money go? And more importantly, where did Sarah go? Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. David Chun stood in the doorway, his presence a stark contrast to the shadows. the investigator she'd seen briefly weeks ago. He was a lean Asian man in his 40s with piercing, observant eyes. "You're making a lot of noise for someone who's trying to be sneaky," he said quietly, his voice devoid of accusation, merely stating a fact. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to explode. "Who are you?" "Someone who wants the same answers you do." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, isolating them in the dimly lit room. "Sarah Williams hired me 2 months before she disappeared. She said she was in trouble, pregnant, and that the father was trying to force her into something she didn't want." "Richard Montgomery?" Grace whispered, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. David nodded grimly. "Sarah worked here. He took advantage of her. When she got pregnant, he offered her money to disappear quietly and give up the baby. She refused. She wanted to keep her child, so they made her disappear anyway." Grace felt tears burning her eyes, a mix of grief and rage. "Is she alive?" "I don't know," David said honestly, his face etched with concern. "I've been investigating for 18 months. Every lead goes nowhere. It's like she vanished into thin air. But I know one thing. These people are covering something up. And that baby upstairs is at the center of it." Grace finished, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have to get him out of here. You can't just take him. That's kidnapping. They'll destroy you," David warned, his voice firm. David pulled out a card and handed it to Grace. "But if you help me find proof, real proof, we can bring them down legally together." Grace took the card, her fingers trembling. "What kind of proof?" "Anything that shows the adoption was fraudulent, evidence that Sarah was coerced or threatened, or," he paused, his voice taking on a somber tone, "evidence of what they did to her." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace looked at the photographs on her phone, a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. "I have the adoption papers. The signature is forged." David's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. "Can you send those to me?" Grace hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Sending these files meant crossing a line she couldn't uncross. It meant declaring war on the Montgomerys, becoming their enemy. But then she thought of Sarah, scared, alone, pregnant with Oliver, and the scales tipped. She forwarded the photos, sealing her fate. "I'll need a few days to verify these," David said, his voice professional, his eyes still gleaming with intensity. "In the meantime, act normal. Don't let them suspect anything." He slipped out through the back door, disappearing like a ghost into the night. Grace stood alone in the office, feeling like she had just jumped off a cliff, the ground rushing up to meet her with terrifying speed. The next morning, everything fell apart, shattering her carefully constructed facade. Grace arrived at 6:30 to find Victoria waiting in the kitchen, her face ashen with rage. Richard stood beside her, his expression cold and menacing. Between them on the table lay Grace's phone, a silent testament to her betrayal. "Explain this," Victoria demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "Explain why you have private documents from my husband's office on your phone." Grace's world tilted, the carefully laid plans crumbling around her. "How? When? It doesn't matter how," Richard said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a thief," Richard said coldly, cutting her off. "And you're fired. I want you out of this house in 5 minutes or I'm calling the police." "No," Grace protested, panic rising in her chest. "Oliver needs me. He won't eat for anyone else. You can't dash." "We'll manage," Victoria said, her voice hard. "Get out now." Grace heard crying from upstairs, Oliver's distressed cries piercing her heart. He sensed something was wrong, his little world thrown into chaos. "Please," Grace begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "Let me at least say goodbye to him." "Absolutely not," Richard said, his voice final. "Security is on the way. Leave now or be arrested." Grace's legs barely held her as she stumbled towards the door, her body leaden with despair. Behind her, Oliver's crying grew louder, more desperate, his cries tearing at her soul. He was calling for her, his cries echoing through the house. She turned back one last time, her gaze meeting Victoria's. "I know the truth about Sarah, about everything." Victoria's face went even paler, the carefully constructed mask of composure cracking. "And I'm not stopping," Grace declared, her voice ringing with newfound determination. "I'm going to find out what you did to my sister, and I'm getting that baby back." She walked out into the cold morning air, tears streaming down her face, the sound of Oliver's heart-wrenching screams following her all the way to her car, a haunting reminder of what she had lost. She had lost him, but the fight had just begun. The best is yet to come. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Grace sat in her car outside the Montgomery mansion for 20 minutes, crying so hard she couldn't breathe, her body racked with sobs. Inside, Oliver was screaming for her, his cries a constant echo in her mind, that desperate sound that tore her heart into a million pieces. But the security guard was at the gate now, watching her, waiting for her to leave. She drove away because she had no choice, her wheels spinning in the gravel. But she wasn't giving up. David Chun called her an hour later. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" "No." Grace's voice was raw with emotion, barely a whisper. "They took my phone. They know I have the documents, and they won't let me near Oliver." "The documents you sent me, I forwarded them to a lawyer friend," David said, his voice firm. "Grace, that signature is definitely forged. We have proof the adoption was fraudulent." Grace's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. So we can get Oliver back? It's complicated. We need to prove Sarah didn't consent, which means we need to find out what happened to her. And we need to move fast before the Montgomerys destroy evidence or disappear with the baby. What do I do? Meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street in an hour. We need to plan this carefully. The coffee shop was nearly empty, the early morning hours leaving it in a state of quiet solitude. David sat in the back corner, a laptop open in front of him, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Grace slid into the seat across from him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I've been investigating the Montgomerys for 18 months, David said quietly, his voice low and intense. Richard Montgomery is a venture capitalist with connections to half the judges in Connecticut. Victoria comes from old money. Together, they're basically untouchable. There has to be something, Grace said desperately, her voice laced with urgency. David turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a bank statement, the cold numbers stark against the white background. Sarah was supposed to receive $50,000 for giving up the baby. But look at this. The money was transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. Not to Sarah's account. Someone else took that money. Who? I don't know yet, but I have a theory. David pulled up another document, his movements precise and deliberate. 3 weeks after Sarah disappeared, Richard's company made a large payment to a man named Marcus Webb, private security. The kind of guy who makes problems disappear. Grace felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the implications of David's words hitting her with full force. You think they hurt her? I think they paid someone to make sure Sarah couldn't come back for her baby. Whether that means paying her to leave the country or... He didn't finish the sentence, the unspoken horror hanging heavy in the air. Grace covered her mouth, fighting back tears, the weight of Sarah's fate pressing down on her. We have to find her. She could still be alive. That's what I've been trying to do, David said, his expression grim. But Grace, you need to prepare yourself. If Sarah was a threat to their adoption, if she refused to stay quiet, David's expression was grim, a silent acknowledgement of the dark possibilities. People like the Montgomerys don't leave loose ends. That afternoon, Grace went to the police station, armed with copies of everything, the forged signature, the bank statements, the timeline of Sarah's disappearance. The detective who met with her was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Detective James Riley, his face etched with years of dealing with the darker side of humanity. Let me get this straight, he said after she finished explaining, his voice laced with skepticism. You think the Montgomerys kidnapped your sister's baby and made her disappear? I don't think... I know, Grace said, her voice rising with frustration. Look at the evidence. Detective Riley flipped through the papers without much interest, his eyes glazed over. What I see is a legal adoption. Private but legal. The signature might be questionable, but that's a civil matter, not criminal. And your sister's disappearance was investigated. We found no evidence of foul play. Because you didn't look hard enough. Grace's voice rose, echoing in the sterile confines of the police station. Richard Montgomery has connections. He paid someone off. The case was closed too fast. Miss Williams, I understand you're upset, but accusations like this are serious. The Montgomerys are respected members of this community. Without solid evidence. I just showed you evidence. I can't open an investigation based on suspicions and civil disputes, he said, handing the papers back to her, his expression dismissive. My advice, get a lawyer. Handle this through the courts. Grace wanted to scream, to shatter the placid facade of indifference. The police wouldn't help. The law wouldn't help. No one would help because the Montgomerys had money and power, and she had nothing. She walked out of the police station feeling more alone than ever. That night, Margaret called her, her voice trembling with fear. Grace, you need to be careful. Mrs. Montgomery knows you went to the police. She's furious. She's talking about getting a restraining order against you. I don't care. I'm not backing down, Grace said, her voice ringing with defiance. You don't understand. These people are dangerous. After you left today, I heard Mr. Montgomery on the phone. He was talking about handling the situation permanently. Grace, I think he was talking about you. Grace's blood went cold, a shiver of dread running down her spine. What exactly did he say? He said, we dealt with the problem once before. We can do it again. And then he mentioned Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb, the security guy David had told her about? The one who made problems disappear. Margaret, I need to know everything you remember about Sarah. Everything she said everywhere she went. There was a long pause, the silence thick with unspoken fear. Then Margaret spoke so quietly that Grace almost couldn't hear her. There's something I never told anyone. The day before Sarah disappeared, I found her crying in the kitchen. She said Mr. Montgomery told her that if she didn't sign the papers and leave quietly, something bad would happen to her family. She was terrified. She asked me what she should do. And Margaret's voice broke, choked with regret. I told her to just take the money and run. I told her it wasn't worth fighting them. And the next day she was gone. Grace felt tears burning her eyes, a wave of guilt washing over her. It's not your fault. I should have helped her. I should have done something. And now that baby is trapped in this house with people who see him as property, not a child. I'm going to get him out, Grace vowed, her voice filled with unwavering resolve. I promise you. How? They have security, lawyers. The police won't help you. Grace didn't have an answer, her mind racing, searching for a solution. a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But she knew one thing. She couldn't let Oliver stay in that house. Not with people who destroyed Sarah to get him. The next morning, Dr. Helen Carter called Grace, her voice filled with concern. Grace, I heard you were let go from the Montgomery home. Is that true? Yes, they fired me. I see. Well, I need to tell you something. I was just at the house for Oliver's checkup. He's refusing to eat again. He's lost weight. Victoria is talking about taking him to specialists, but Grace, I think that baby is grieving. He's looking for you. Grace's heart shattered. The image of Oliver's tiny, sad face flashing through her mind. Can you tell them to let me come back? I tried. Victoria refused. She's very angry with you about something, though she wouldn't say what. Dr. Carter paused, her voice softening. But Grace, between you and me, that child needs you. Whatever happened between you and the Montgomerys, Oliver shouldn't suffer for it. I'm trying to help him. I'm trying to do what's right. Then try harder, Grace pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. Because that little boy is fading, and I don't know how much longer he can go on like this. The call ended, leaving Grace sitting in her apartment, feeling the walls closing in on her, suffocating her with despair. Oliver was suffering. Sarah was missing or worse, and she was powerless to help either of them. Then her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. If you want answers about your sister, come to 847 Industrial Road tonight at 10 p.m. Come alone. Grace stared at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. It was obviously a trap, a blatant attempt to lure her into danger. But what choice did she have? Industrial Road was in the worst part of town, a desolate landscape of abandoned warehouses and empty lots, a haven for criminals and the forgotten. Grace parked her car at 9:50, her hands trembling as she turned off the ignition. The address was an old warehouse with broken windows and a rusted door, a place where nightmares came to life. She almost turned around, succumbing to the fear that threatened to consume her. This was insane. But then she thought of Sarah, alone and scared, her life stolen from her. She thought of Oliver crying for her, his innocent voice pleading for help. Grace got out of the car and walked towards the warehouse, her steps hesitant but determined. The door was unlocked, a silent invitation into the abyss. Inside, it was dark and cold, lit only by slivers of moonlight filtering through the broken roof, casting long, eerie shadows. Hello? She called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. A figure stepped out of the shadows, solidifying into a man she recognized with a jolt of terror, Marcus Webb. He was a big man in his 40s with cold, calculating eyes, his presence radiating menace. You've been asking a lot of questions, he said, his voice a low growl. Grace's whole body tensed, every muscle coiled and ready to react. Where's my sister? That's the thing, he said, his lips curving into a cruel smile. I don't know. Marcus moved closer, his bulk intimidating. Richard Montgomery hired me to convince her to leave town and never come back. He gave me $50,000 to hand to her and put her on a bus to anywhere she wanted to go. And did you? I tried, but your sister wouldn't take the money. She said she'd rather die than give up her baby. She said she was going to expose Richard, tell everyone what he did. Marcus's expression hardened, his eyes turning cold and unforgiving. So, Richard made a new offer, $100,000 if I made sure she couldn't come back. Ever. Grace felt like she was falling, the world spinning around her. What did you do to her? Nothing, because she ran, Marcus said, his voice surprisingly devoid of emotion. I went to meet her at the bus station like we planned, and she was gone, vanished. I still don't know how she did it. Marcus pulled out an envelope, its edges worn. This is the $50,000. I've been holding on to it for 18 months, waiting to see if she'd surface, but she never did. He handed the envelope to Grace, his gaze unwavering. I'm not a good man. I've done bad things for money, but I didn't hurt your sister, and I need you to know that before this gets any uglier. Why are you telling me this? Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mind reeling from the revelations. Because Richard Montgomery is planning to make you disappear, too, tonight. He thinks I'm here to handle you, but I'm done working for him. He paused, his eyes softening slightly. That baby in his house, that's Sarah's son, and he deserves to know the truth. Marcus walked towards the door, then stopped, turning back to face her one last time. If your sister is smart, she's hiding somewhere safe, waiting for the right moment to come back. But if she's not, he looked back at Grace, his expression grim. Then you're that baby's only chance. Don't waste it. He left, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Grace standing there, holding $50,000 in cash, her mind spinning with confusion and renewed hope. Sarah had run. She was alive, or she had been 18 months ago. Grace's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. It was David Chun. Grace, where are you? I just found something. Richard Montgomery has a private property in upstate New York, an old farmhouse. It's registered under a shell company, but I traced it back to him. If Sarah is alive and he's keeping her hidden, give me the address, Grace said, her voice filled with urgency. The next morning, Grace drove 4 hours north to a small town near the Canadian border, her heart pounding with each mile. The farmhouse was at the end of a dirt road surrounded by dense woods, its isolation both comforting and terrifying. It looked abandoned, but there was a car parked outside, a clear sign of habitation. Grace's hands shook as she knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. No answer. She tried the knob and to her surprise it turned. Unlocked. Inside, the house was old, but clean and well-maintained. Someone was living here, tending to this isolated retreat. Grace walked through the kitchen, the living room, her senses on high alert, her heart pounding in her chest. She went up the creaking stairs, each step a testament to the house's age. And there, in a small bedroom at the end of the hall, she found her. Sarah, her sister, was sitting by the window, her figure gaunt and her face pale, staring blankly at nothing. When she heard Grace's footsteps, she turned, and her face went white with shock. Grace! Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, a fragile echo of the vibrant woman she once knew. Grace ran to her, tears streaming down her face, pulling her sister into a hug so tight it hurt, a desperate attempt to mend the years of separation and pain. Sarah burst into tears, her body racked with sobs. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to come back. I wanted to fight for him. But Richard said if I ever showed my face again, he'd have me arrested for blackmail and fraud. He said I'd go to prison and never see my baby again. So I hid. I've been hiding here for 18 months. Too scared to move. Grace pulled back, holding Sarah's face in her hands, her eyes filled with love and compassion. It's over, Sarah. We have proof the adoption was fraud. We're getting Oliver back. Sarah's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror, a reflection of the conflicting emotions raging within her. Is he okay? Is my baby okay? He will be, Grace said, her voice filled with unwavering confidence. Because we're going to bring him home. But outside the farmhouse, hidden in the shadows of the trees, a black car sat watching, its presence a silent omen. Inside, someone made a phone call, their voice low and menacing. I found them both. What do you want me to do? On the other end of the line, Richard Montgomery's voice was cold and final, devoid of any trace of humanity. End this tonight, D. Grace saw the headlights through the farmhouse window, a black car moving slowly up the dirt road, its approach deliberate and menacing. Her stomach dropped, a wave of terror washing over her. Sarah, we need to leave now. They ran through the kitchen and out the back door into the woods, the darkness a thick blanket around them, the branches whipping their faces as they stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind them, men's voices shouted, their pursuit relentless. Grace called David Chun as they ran, her voice breathless with panic. We found Sarah, but Richard had sent people. We're in the woods behind the farmhouse. I'm calling the state police right now. Stay hidden. They hid behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with fear. Grace spotted an old hunting cabin in the distance, a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness, and they ran for it, barricading themselves inside, their hands fumbling with the makeshift lock. A voice called out from the woods, closer now, more threatening. Miss Williams, Mr. Montgomery just wants to talk. He's prepared to make a very generous offer. Enough money for both of you to disappear. Grace felt rage burning through her fear, a fierce protectiveness rising within her. What about Oliver? The boy is legally their son. That's not negotiable. It's not fair. Sarah screamed suddenly, her voice filled with raw pain. He's my baby. I carried him for 9 months. Richard Montgomery took him from me because he has money and I have nothing. But he's mine. Then they heard sirens in the distance, their wail a beacon of hope in the darkness. The men outside cursed, their voices filled with frustration, and ran, disappearing into the woods. Grace and Sarah collapsed against each other, crying and laughing at the same time, relief washing over them in a tidal wave. The next 3 days were a blur of activity, lawyers, statements, documents being filed, a whirlwind of legal maneuvering that threatened to overwhelm them. David's lawyer friend, a sharp and determined woman named Patricia Lynn, took Sarah's case, her movements efficient and her resolve unwavering. The forged signature is enough to invalidate the adoption, Patricia explained in her office, her voice confident. Combined with evidence of coercion and the fact that Sarah never received the payment, we have a strong case. But the Montgomerys will fight this with everything they have. I don't care, Sarah said, her voice stronger now, steadier, her eyes shining with a newfound determination. I'm not running anymore. I want my son back. The hearing was set for Friday morning, the culmination of their desperate fight. The courtroom was cold and formal, its atmosphere charged with tension. Victoria and Richard sat on one side with their expensive legal team, their faces grim and unyielding. Sarah sat on the other with Patricia, looking terrified but resolute, her hand gripping Grace's tightly. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. Richard's lawyers argued that the adoption was legal and in Oliver's best interest, painting a picture of stability and privilege. But when Patricia presented the forged signature and Marcus Webb's sworn statement, the judge's expression changed, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Miss Williams, the judge said, addressing Sarah directly, why didn't you come forward sooner? Sarah stood up, her voice shaking but clear, her words filled with truth. Because I was terrified, Your Honor. Richard Montgomery told me if I ever tried to get my son back, he'd have me arrested. He has money and power and I have nothing. But my son needs to know his real mother never stopped loving him. The judge looked at the Montgomerys, his eyes filled with disapproval. What you did was illegal and morally unconscionable. I'm ordering an immediate investigation and granting temporary custody of Oliver to his biological mother, Sarah Williams. Sarah collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, The weight of the past lifted from her shoulders. Grace ran to her, holding her sister close, her heart overflowing with joy and relief. 2 hours later, Grace and Sarah stood outside the Montgomery mansion with a police officer and a social worker. Their mission to bring Oliver home at long last. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might explode. Her anticipation a mix of excitement and trepidation. The social worker knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. Victoria answered, her face puffy and red from crying, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. She looked at Sarah with such hatred that Grace instinctively stepped between them, a protective barrier against Victoria's venom. Where is he? Sarah asked quietly, her voice trembling but firm, her determination unwavering. Victoria didn't answer, her silence a testament to her defeat. She just turned and walked up the stairs, her shoulders slumped in resignation. They followed her to the nursery, their footsteps echoing in the silent house. Oliver was sitting in his crib, looking small and sad and tired, his little face pale and drawn. When he saw Grace, his face lit up, a radiant smile spreading across his features, and he stood, reaching for her with his tiny hands. But then he saw Sarah, his eyes widening with curiosity, his little face searching hers, and for a moment, everything stopped, the world holding its breath. Oliver stared at Sarah, his little face confused. Sarah's hands trembled, a visible tremor shaking her as she moved slowly, hesitantly toward the crib. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, fear, hope, and a profound sense of guilt. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat, thick with unshed tears. "Hi, my sweet boy, I'm your mama." The words felt foreign, unfamiliar after so long. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to get back to you, but I'm here now. I'm finally here." Oliver, nestled amongst the soft blankets, simply stared back at her, his large innocent eyes filled with a childlike curiosity. He didn't cry, didn't coo, just observed her with an unnerving intensity. Then, with a movement that stole Sarah's breath, he slowly reached out his little hand. Sarah, heart pounding in her chest, took it. Oliver's tiny fingers wrapped tentatively around hers, a fragile connection forming between them. His eyes, still wide, suddenly shimmered with tears, as if some forgotten part of him, a deep, wordless place, recognized her. A mother's instinct, buried deep within her soul, surfaced with a fierce protectiveness. With infinite care, Sarah scooped him up into her arms. Oliver, in turn, buried his face in the crook of her neck, his small body trembling slightly. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound. He just held on tight, clinging to her as if he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life, a lifetime of longing condensed into a single, desperate embrace. Grace, standing in the doorway, watched her sister cradle her son for the first time in 18 long, agonizing months. The sight was almost unbearable. Tears streamed freely down her face, a mixture of relief, joy, and profound sadness for all the lost time. Victoria stood beside her, her own face a mask of conflicting emotions, tears cascading down her cheeks. "I love him," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I know you won't believe me, but I do. I loved him like he was mine." Sarah looked up, her gaze meeting Victoria's, and Grace saw something unexpected in her sister's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but something akin to understanding, a glimmer of shared pain. "Then you know how it feels to lose him?" Sarah said softly, her voice laced with a quiet sorrow. "That's what you took from me. Every day for 18 months, I lost him piece by piece." Victoria had no answer for that. The weight of Sarah's words, the truth of her suffering, was a heavy burden. She turned and silently left the room, leaving Sarah and Oliver bathed in the soft glow of the nursery lamp. The next few weeks were a delicate dance. Oliver was understandably confused, disoriented by the sudden change in his life, but slowly, patiently, he adjusted. Sarah sang to him in the evenings, her voice a soothing balm to his troubled spirit. She played with him, building towers of blocks that inevitably came crashing down, each tumble eliciting a giggle. She fed him with love, spoon-feeding him pureed vegetables with unwavering devotion. And Grace was there every step of the way, a constant source of support and encouragement. Dr. Carter, a kindly pediatrician with a reassuring smile, checked on Oliver regularly. "He's eating well, gaining weight, and most importantly," he declared with a twinkle in his eye, "he's happy." Margaret, her face etched with remorse, came to visit once, bringing a bag overflowing with toys. "I'm sorry I didn't help you," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "You helped in the end," Sarah replied, offering a small, forgiving smile. "That's what mattered." 6 months later, Grace stood in the doorway of Sarah's small but cozy apartment, watching her sister play with Oliver on the floor. The little boy was laughing now, a genuine, uninhibited laugh that filled the room with joy. He was thriving, blossoming under Sarah's unwavering love. Sarah looked up and smiled, her eyes radiating gratitude. "Thank you for everything, for not giving up on me. You're my sister," Grace said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what family does." Oliver, sensing the warmth and love between the two women, toddled over to Grace, his arms outstretched. She picked him up, and he patted her face with his chubby hands, babbling happily. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "If Oliver hadn't refused to eat for everyone except you, none of this would have happened." Grace kissed Oliver's forehead, her heart overflowing with love. Love always finds a way. A year later, they had pooled their resources and bought a small house together, a haven filled with laughter and love. Through the kitchen window, Grace watched Sarah push Oliver on a swing in the backyard. The little boy was 3 now, a vibrant, energetic child, talking and laughing like any healthy toddler should. The trauma of his early months seemed like a distant memory. That evening, they sat around the dinner table with David, Grace's fiancé, who'd seamlessly integrated into their unconventional family, becoming an integral part of their lives. Oliver, beaming with pride, held up his sippy cup. "Toast," he announced proudly, his voice filled with glee. They all raised their glasses, their hearts filled with gratitude. "To family," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "To family," they echoed, their voices blending in a harmonious chorus. And in that small kitchen with mismatched chairs and laughter that filled every corner, they had everything that mattered. Because in the end, it wasn't about mansions or money or societal expectations. It was about love. Real love. The kind that fights for what's right, the kind that forgives, the kind that heals, the kind that never gives up, the kind that brings us home. Moral asterisk: sometimes the people who seem invisible, the cleaning lady, the helper, the person society overlooks, are the ones with the biggest hearts and the strongest courage. They possess an inner strength that defies expectations. Money and power can buy many things, material possessions and fleeting pleasures, but they can't buy integrity, love, or the enduring bonds of true family. These are treasures earned through kindness, compassion, and unwavering loyalty. When we stand up for what's right, even against seemingly impossible odds, we discover a resilience within ourselves, a strength we never knew we possessed. And sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness, like picking up a crying baby, offering a helping hand, or simply lending a listening ear, can change the world, one life at a time. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments below. And if it touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Stories like this need to be told, need to be heard, and your support helps us bring hope to those who need it most, reminding them that even in the darkest of times, love and compassion can prevail.